I got to witness both sides of a toxic relationship with an extremely unfaithful, abusive partner. So I don't care if this is the right subreddit for this, but this happened a while ago to a guy I eventually became good friends with. I, 20 meters at the time, was originally friends with his girlfriend, 19, long before they started dating. However, I became very close to both of them in the time they dated. I ended up spending a lot of time with either one or both of them together, within the 3-year time span their relationship lasted. He, 24, knew he never had to worry about his girlfriend being alone with me because I'm gay. Still, because of this unique position I found myself in, where I eventually became equally close to both parties, I had the unique opportunity to witness both sides of the story when all the bullshit unraveled. So when the girl, we'll call her Alexis, started sneaking around behind her boyfriends, we'll call him Mark, back, this sort of behavior wasn't anything new to her. I've known this girl since we were children, as she grew up several houses away. Therefore, I had many opportunities to see how she behaved in her relationships. This long-established history, however, was also why I didn't involve myself when she began cheating. I hadn't yet become very close to Mark. I probably only knew him for a few months. But because Alexis knew I could keep my mouth shut, she told me everything. Oftentimes, I even got to be there to see it happen for myself. I don't necessarily mean that I was in the same room watching another dude take her to Pound Town, although that also happened on a few occasions. I instead would usually be in the same building or right outside, knowing what she was inside doing. Knowing that the only reason she dragged me along with her to some random place was so that she could meet one of her side pieces. And she had quite a few, most of which I also got to know fairly well, even becoming close with 2 of them. As far as I'm aware, Alexis's infidelity began with one of the 2 guys that I also became close friends with. It began innocently enough when he started hanging out more frequently with Alexis and me, while Mark was away at work. He worked odd hours, or resting during the day. When Mark learned about the other guy spending so much time with us, Alexis presented him to Mark as her sister's friend, with whom she also developed a friendship. How they met was the truth, but he was a lot more than just a friend to her. And over time, he was far from the only new friend to come into her life. Mark didn't seem to start questioning things until his girlfriend's behavior became a lot more suspicious. She'd suddenly spend large gaps of time away from him, giving him any excuse she pulled out of her ass at that moment. At times, she even dared to tell him the most blatantly obvious lies I've ever heard. And for the longest time, I would repeatedly find myself baffled by Mark's refusal to take the bullshit she was selling him as anything other than the absolute truth. Her behavior eventually created tension between them, resulting in frequent fights, many of which I also was there to see. Some of these fights even became intense at times. Mark, however, still wanted to make the relationship work with her, despite the growing severity of their conflicts. Even Alexis pulling a knife on him one evening while the 3 of us were socializing in his kitchen was not enough to convince him to leave. He later told me that that had not been the first time she attempted to stab him, so I guess he was pretty much used to it by that point. To make things worse, Alexis had a habit of accusing Mark of cheating on her, despite admitting to me, that she was fully aware of how committed to her he was, and she accused him of cheating over the most meaningless things, too. Mark so much as looking in another woman's direction for longer than she was okay with was reason enough for her to accuse him. She made him stop talking to any female friends he had before they met. He couldn't like any photos posted by other women on social media, and she wasn't okay with him even speaking directly to women other than her, even innocently. There were times she made exceptions for him talking to women, but those exceptions only came for interactions he could not avoid, like when he was talking to a cashier, restaurant server. And even in the few circumstances she permitted it, if their conversation sounded just a little too friendly for her, she would lose it. In the best-case scenarios, she'd begin pointless arguments, and during the worst scenarios, she would full-on start swinging at him the very moment the 3 of us were alone again. Frequently, she used these unnecessary conflicts as a guise, giving her legitimate reason to avoid him for periods, so that she would be able to cheat without arousing her boyfriend's suspicion. As mentioned earlier, she had many guys she regularly saw. I'm not sure of an exact number. I know of at least 7. I won't detail the drama that occurred in our interactions with any of them. This post would become an entire novel if I tried to. But instead, we'll skip to the last few months of their relationship, when her inability to stay loyal resulted in a pregnancy she was seriously panicked to learn about. She had very few clues as to who the actual father might be. And all this was happening just a couple of months after Mark unexpectedly walked into undeniable proof of Alexis's actions during the middle of her graduation ceremony. Her younger sister unintentionally told him, and it broke him. He and I started to become much closer friends after this happened. We became such close friends that I finally had to ask Alexis to stop telling me about her sexual conquests. I was beginning to feel guilty for the staggering amount of information I withheld from Mark. There were just so many things fucked up about their relationship. She could cheat but was entitled to his loyalty. Some of the guys she was sleeping with were the same guys Mark considered to be his closest friends in high school. My guilt increased tenfold when I fell on hard times and became homeless, only for Mark to open his door to me after Alexis asked if he could help me out. It was his parents' home, but only Mark and his brother-in-law lived there. He had to sneak me around the brother-in-law, though, because his parents, as well as the sister who had married the brother-in-law, were particularly racist. I'm also Black. And homophobic people. So I knew I wasn't supposed to be there. I just didn't have other options available at the time. So I bet you can imagine just how shitty I felt about myself to have him taking such a big risk for me, while I happened to have an extensive library of knowledge about Alexis's misdeeds, both before and after her graduation ceremony, where Mark only learned about 2 of them. I also knew it was still happening, even after I told Alexis not to tell me anything anymore. While she agreed that she would stop telling me, she instead found ways to indirectly tell me, or make it so obvious that I had no doubts about what she was up to. What kept me from ever saying anything was just how much longer I had known Alexis for. She had become almost like a sister to me, and at that time had always treated me well. She didn't display any of the same toxic behaviors in her friendships that she shamelessly demonstrated in her relationships. That has since changed, or I wouldn't even be writing this. But as I became closer friends with Mark, being pretty much her only confidant was becoming an increasingly difficult role to take on. The burden of carrying a compounding list of all her betrayals was just becoming more than I was able to bear. I thought I made that clear to her when I requested to be left in the dark on certain things. So just imagine my surprise on the day she learned of her pregnancy when she told me that I had to tell Mark that the baby was his, because she knew he would listen me. You see, she didn't just want Mark to be the father. She needed it to be him, because he was hands down the best candidate out of everyone that she was sleeping with. Yeah, Mark lived in his parents' home, but it was by choice, not necessity. He had a stable job, char income, and he was still trying to make things work with her, even after he found out that she had cheated on him multiple times with multiple guys. But above all else, what appealed to her was the fact that Mark's family had money. All the other potential fathers had some major issues Mark didn't, ultimately preventing her from believing they'd be suitable fathers for her baby. They were either equally as unfaithful as she was, broke, on heroin, a few were felons, one was underage, along with many other things she wasn't looking for in a father to her child. She expected me to lie to his face about something that would have changed his entire life. I couldn't believe how far she was willing to take her deception, and she and I ended up getting into a heated argument. When I did finally talk to Mark, I didn't tell him anything I knew he didn't already know. I could have, but I was still very conflicted over the entire situation. What I did tell him was to only sign the birth certificate after they performed a DNA test, advice he seemed unsure of at the time, but later became very grateful to have taken as the baby wasn't his. Big surprise, LOL. Their relationship eventually ended. Mark moved states, and he and I fell out of contact for several years. I've talked to him since. This all occurred about 10 years ago, and he seems like he's doing a lot better. He repeatedly thanked me for the solid advice I gave him that evening, because I guess his ex came close to manipulating him into signing 18 years of his life away. Elle honestly felt I at least owed him that since he helped me in my time of need, and because I knew the ugly truth about his ex the entire time. He was always aware of the fact that I probably knew far more than I was letting on, but he also understood the uncomfortable position I was in back then, and fortunately never held it against me after everything came out.